It is 0:16 on the 6th of June, 1944, and a wooden and canvas glider the size of a small bus is falling out of a black sky towards a strip of French pasture beside a canal, with no engine, no lights, and no second chance if the pilot has misjudged his approach. Inside sit 28 men of the Ox and Bucks Light Infantry, weighed down with rifles, grenades, and equipment, bracing in the dark as the ground rushes up to meet them faster than seems survivable. The glider's undercarriage tears away on impact, the fuselage grinds across the field in a shower of sparks and splintering wood, and then, extraordinarily, it stops less than 50 meters from its target, a small steel bridge over the Caen Canal that the men have spent months rehearsing to capture in the dark. Major John Howard's second-in-command, Den Brotheridge, is first out, running towards the bridge before the dust has even settled, and within minutes he will become one of the very first Allied soldiers killed on D-Day, shot as his men clear the German positions guarding the crossing. What happens on that bridge in the next few hours will decide whether the entire eastern flank of the Normandy invasion holds or collapses, and it will do so not through weight of numbers or firepower, but through an audacious piece of precision flying that had never before been attempted on this scale, at night, in total darkness, and had to work perfectly the first time, or not at all. By the spring of 1944, Allied planners understood that Normandy's geography created a particular vulnerability on the eastern edge of the invasion beaches. The Caen Canal and the River Orne ran roughly parallel to one another a short distance inland, and together they formed a natural barrier that could work for the Allies or against them depending on who controlled the crossings. If British forces landing on Sword Beach were to push inland and link up with airborne troops dropped further east, they needed the bridges over both waterways intact and in Allied hands before dawn. Left to the Germans, those same bridges became a gateway for armored reinforcements, potentially the 21st Panzer Division stationed near Caen, to drive directly into the flank of the beachhead while it was still weak and disorganized in its first hours ashore. Existing methods of dealing with such a target were crude and largely unsuitable. Naval or aerial bombardment risked destroying the bridges outright, achieving the opposite of what was needed, since a demolished crossing was as useless to the Allies as one held by the enemy. A conventional parachute drop scattered men across a wide area in the dark, sometimes kilometers from their intended objective, which was hardly compatible with a task demanding the bridges be seized within minutes, before German defenders could react or detonate demolition charges rigged beneath the structure. Reconnaissance suggested the crossings were guarded, though not heavily, by German troops who could, if given even a short warning, hold out long enough for reinforcements to arrive or destroy the bridges themselves. The task, then, was not simply to reach the bridges, but to arrive with such suddenness and precision that the garrison had no time to react at all, a requirement that essentially ruled out every method of delivering troops that had been used in warfare up to that point. It seemed, on paper, close to impossible, landing troops silently and exactly on target in pitch darkness without engines to steer by or lights to guide the approach. The answer came from a combination of specialist training and an extraordinary feat of navigation, developed by the Glider Pilot Regiment, working alongside planners at Fleet, Denham, and the Airborne Forces Base at Netheravon, using the Airspeed Horsa glider, a plywood and fabric aircraft roughly 20 meters long, capable of carrying up to 28 fully equipped men or a small artillery piece, and weighing around 3.5 tons empty, comparable to a loaded delivery lorry. Towed behind a Halifax bomber and released several kilometers from the target, the Horsa then had to glide silently down through the dark, guided only by the pilot's stopwatch, compass, and memorized landmarks, since radar and radio beacons of the period were neither precise nor reliable enough for this kind of pinpoint work. The pilots selected for the mission, among them Staff Sergeant Jim Walwork, who flew Major Howard's lead glider, trained for months on scale models of the target area, and rehearsed the approach repeatedly using aerial photographs, learning to judge their descent by the shape of hedgerows and the glint of the canal itself under moonlight. The technique demanded almost surgical accuracy, a controlled descent bringing 3 tons of wood and canvas down at around 100 kilometers an hour. Deliberately clipping through a belt of anti-glider poles the Germans had erected in the field, using the drag to help slow the aircraft rather than avoiding it entirely, before grinding to a halt close enough to the bridge that surprise, rather than firepower, would carry the assault. 6 gliders in total were committed to the operation that night, 3 aimed at the Caen Canal bridge and 3 at the Orne River crossing a short distance away, carrying roughly 180 men of D Company and reinforcing platoons under Howard's overall command. Production of the Horsa itself was substantial for an aircraft type most people have never heard of. Several thousand were built across the war by companies including Airspeed and a network of furniture makers and joinery firms repurposed for wartime aircraft construction, since much of the airframe was built from wood rather than the aluminium reserved for powered aircraft, though precise output figures for any given period remain difficult to pin down, with certainty given the classification and dispersal of wartime manufacturing records. What followed on the ground has become one of the most closely studied small unit actions of the entire war, precisely because so much of it was witnessed and recorded by the men who took part. Howard's glider, the first to land, came down so close to the bridge that some accounts describe the nose of the aircraft coming to rest almost against the perimeter wire, achieving a level of accuracy Howard himself later called extraordinary given the conditions. His men were out and moving within seconds, using grenades and Sten guns to clear the small German garrison in a fight that lasted only minutes rather than hours, though it cost Den Brotheridge his life almost immediately and left several others wounded. The speed of the assault meant German defenders, apparently unprepared for an attack from this direction and in this manner, had no real chance to detonate the demolition charges reportedly wired beneath the bridge, though accounts differ on precisely how ready those charges were to be used at the moment of the attack. Holding the bridge afterwards proved almost as demanding as taking it, as Howard's lightly armed company faced German probing attacks and at least one tank, driven off using a PIAT anti-tank weapon at close range, through the remaining hours of darkness until relief arrived on foot from Lord Lovat's commandos advancing from Sword Beach, reportedly accompanied by a lone piper, Bill Millen, playing them across the crossing in a moment that has since become one of the most retold images of the entire Normandy campaign. If you are finding this interesting, a quick subscribe helps more than you know, and it costs you nothing but a moment. Compared with what German forces attempted elsewhere that night, the coup de main at the bridges stands out for how little it relied on brute force. German airborne doctrine, developed earlier in the war and demonstrated dramatically at Crete in 1941, had favored parachute assault delivering large numbers of lightly equipped troops who then had to fight their way to heavier equipment dropped separately, a method that had produced such heavy casualties over Crete that Hitler reportedly lost confidence in large-scale airborne operations for the remainder of the war. The British glider assault inverted this logic entirely, delivering a small, concentrated, fully equipped force directly onto the objective rather than scattering troops around it and hoping they could regroup under fire. American airborne forces landing further west the same night relied almost exclusively on parachute drops for their initial assault waves and suffered exactly the dispersal problems the glider method was designed to avoid, with entire units scattered across the Cotentin Peninsula, sometimes many kilometers from their intended drop zones, a scattering that, while it created its own unexpected confusion for German defenders, also meant it took American paratroopers considerably longer to concentrate enough force to achieve specific, pinpoint objectives in the way Howard's company achieved theirs within minutes of landing. The precision glider assault pioneered that night at what would become known as Pegasus Bridge was subsequently studied, and in modified form echoed in later airborne operations, though never again attempted with quite the same margin for error, since commanders elsewhere generally judged the risk of landing gliders in darkness, so close to a defended objective, too great to repeat without the exceptional circumstances and training that made the original mission possible. The impact of the operation extended well beyond the tactical value of the bridges themselves. Holding both crossings intact meant British and Canadian forces advancing from Sword Beach were able to link up with the airborne troops securing the eastern flank without the delay or disruption that loss of the bridges would have caused, denying German armor a direct route into the vulnerable early beachhead. Historians remain divided on precisely how decisive this was in isolation, since the wider battle for Normandy involved many interlocking factors, but there is broad agreement that the speed and completeness of the bridge capture removed one of the more serious potential threats to the invasion's eastern flank in its opening hours. Psychologically, the operation became, almost immediately, a symbol of what airborne forces could achieve through precision rather than sheer numbers, a case study taught for decades afterwards in military academies interested in the mechanics of surprise. The bridge itself was renamed Pegasus Bridge shortly after the war in honor of the winged horse insignia worn by British airborne forces, and the original structure, along with one of the Horsa-gliders and a wealth of related material, can still be seen today at the Pegasus Memorial Museum near Ranville, a short walk from the site where Howard's glider came to rest in the dark all those years ago, close enough to the objective that measuring the final distance became something of a point of pride among the men who flew it. Return once more to that field in the darkness just after midnight. The tearing sound of a glider's undercarriage ripping away across French soil, and the sudden disorienting silence that followed as dust and splinters settled around men who had just fallen out of the sky with no engine to carry them there. What was achieved in those first minutes was not simply the capture of a bridge, though the bridge mattered enormously. It was proof of a wider principle, that precision, properly rehearsed and precisely executed, could achieve in minutes what brute force might have taken hours or failed to achieve at all. 3 gliders came down almost exactly where they were meant to, in total darkness, without engines, without a second attempt available if the first went wrong, and within minutes a small, determined force had done what entire battalions elsewhere on that long night struggled for hours to accomplish. It was flying that bordered on the impossible, delivered by men who had rehearsed the impossible until it became merely difficult, and then delivered it precisely once, when precision was the only thing that mattered. The real story behind Pegasus Bridge is not, in the end, a story about a bridge at all. It is a story about how close warfare can come to precision, when men are willing to trust a stopwatch, a compass, and each other in the dark at 100 kilometers an hour, with absolutely no room left for a second chance.